Well, Australians see Peter Dutton as a more experienced, decisive and stronger leader than Anthony Albanese, according to new polling out today. Newspoll, which is one of the country's most respected polling companies, also found that Dutton is just ahead of Albanese when it comes to the question of which leader understands the major issues better and has a vision for the country. The danger for Labor is that the perception is now cementing of Peter Dutton as a stronger and more decisive leader. And increasingly, Albanese is looking weak as PM. A rollout of coalition MPs made the point today that the Prime Minister is ignoring the major issues affecting Australians, and this is reflected in the polls.
Australians are saying, no, we don't feel safer and we don't feel as though we're better off.
I don't think it's surprising that in an environment when people are feeling cost of living pressures that we're seeing polls tighten.
The reality is that it's getting more and more difficult every single day for them.
Well, Labor always relied on the premise that Dutton was unpopular and unelectable. And this week's Newspoll came as quite a shock to them. It showed that Peter Dutton is catching up to Albanese. It turns out his leadership style is suiting the times. His perceived flaws are morphing into attributes. We're living in an age of unrest, economic uncertainty, eroding social cohesion, lawlessness and youth crime. The Prime Minister struggles to even acknowledge or vocalise the immense daily problems voters are facing, let alone sanction ministers whose policy failures exacerbate these major issues. In the past, Albanese has crafted his image around being the likeable bloke Aussies would want to have a beer with, and Labor has celebrated that Peter Dutton is perceived by voters as less likeable, more of a tough, hard politician. Even Liberal strategists initially tried to soften the opposition leader's image. Now, that's mostly unnecessary. Voters just may be looking for someone to be tough on detainees, to deport the child rapists and murderers, to arrest the pro-Palestinian activists vandalising our streets, to stop the hate speech and to tackle the cost of living crisis. With Dutton's ascension in the polls comes concerns in Labor ranks that Albanese doesn't recognise the task ahead of him before the next election. And there's a similarity here with The Voice. In the months leading up to the referendum, when the polls pointed to a sharp defeat, an upbeat and optimistic Albanese remained convinced it would all come good in the end. He was convinced he would prevail and The Voice would win. Convinced, as he said repeatedly, that Australians would eventually do the right thing.
I have faith in the Australian people. And I have faith that we will put our case, and I'll ask people to comment as well. But I've always had faith in the Australian people. Where's the downside here? What are people risking here?
In fact, Albanese was so confident that The Voice would win, he didn't even bother to find a model that would have bipartisan support, because he didn't want to share the glory. Because for Albanese, The Voice wasn't just for Indigenous Australians, but it was meant to be the defining feature of his own legacy. Well, Peter Dutton at a press conference today asked what vision for Australia Albanese now had apart from The Voice.
And this is a government that's 2 years old. Frankly, it looks 22 years old. He can talk big, but he never delivers. And apart from The Voice, what agenda does this government have?
And you can see that Dutton is sharpening up his pre-election messages. But it strikes me that we're now in a similar situation to that of The Voice ahead of the next election. The polls for weeks now have shown that Albanese is headed into minority government at best. Yet he's got the blinkers on, convinced everything will be fine. All the while, his government is lurching from scandal to scandal. And most scandals are defined by his own weakness. The Prime Minister failed to even make a phone call to any Chinese minister after an aggressive near miss from a Chinese fighter jet. He's failed to sack his scandal-prone immigration minister at the expense of community safety, as the Perth grandmother Ninette Simmons would attest. And during a cost of living crisis, there's been no apology from Albanese or even an explanation for why his $10 billion housing fund has not delivered a single new house. The role of PM has shone a spotlight on Albanese's flaws, particularly his inability to grasp detail and his lack of authority over his ministry. You could say, at heart, he's actually ill-suited to the role of Prime Minister and even inept at leading our country. There is now serious anxiety within Labor about Albanese's chance of winning the next election. And the concern is that Albanese doesn't recognise the extent of the problem. Only 1/3 of voters support Albanese. As we spoke about last night, the party's primary vote is now the same as it was at the last election. And these are historic lows for Labor. The challenges facing our nation are immense and historically significant. The very essence of what makes up our successful multicultural society is fracturing. We see it on a daily basis. And parts of our suburbs are gripped by extreme poverty. A cost of living crisis doubling up with an anti-Semitism crisis. Australians have no confidence that Albanese has what it takes to lead and govern our country during these fraught times. And as if proving this very point, over the past 2 days, the Prime Minister has tried to shift the dial by using climate change as a distraction from the central issues gripping our nation. Just like with the voice to Parliament, voters marvel at how out of touch the boy who made it out of Housing Commission has now become.